You heard from our first guest why we need the Department of Education. Now you're going to hear from someone who believes we should get rid of it. I'm Jenna, and this is Smarter News. First up in our SmartHER series on education, we heard from Arne Duncan. He's the former Secretary of Education under President Obama. If you missed that conversation, we aired it yesterday. He told us why he believes federal oversight is so key to the success of education in our country. Now we're going to hear a completely different perspective from Erika Donalds. She serves as the chair of the America First Policy Institute's Center for Education Opportunity. A few personal points for Erika. She is the wife of Congressman Byron Donalds, a Republican from Florida, who's now going to be running for governor of the state. She's also a mom of 3 kiddos, which is something we have in common, Erika. So 3 is just enough to either keep you on your toes or drive you crazy. It depends on the day, right?
Well, and it depends on the kids. I always joke that my third one is like 2, so it's kind of like having 4.
I'm going to use that with my third because I actually believe that. I think suddenly you get past that number and you're like, what's adding a few more at this point? I'm really fascinated with your personal evolution too. I see that you had a really successful career, continue to in business, but that you also have this expertise in education. So tell us a little bit about that. How did you start in the business world and how did you transfer some of that or apply some of that into a passion about education?
Yeah, I started my career in business, in financial services. I was a CPA, I have a master's in accounting, and I worked my way up in an investment management firm to the chief financial officer and a managing partner. And so I had really achieved a lot of what I wanted to achieve in my career when I made the questionable life decision to run for school board. And I did that just as a community service. And, my kids, I had 3 boys, as you mentioned. I felt like I needed something different and I didn't feel like my views were well represented on the school board, so I ran. But it really opened my eyes to how broken our education system is in America. And the fact that my husband and I have achieved our success through education. We both came from very disadvantaged backgrounds and have achieved success simply because we had a good education to catapult us here. And so we're very passionate about making sure that others have the same opportunity. So I've been dedicating my life over the past 10 years to expanding school choice, bringing free market principles into education, and working on solid education policy at the state and now federal level.
What was the impetus to wanting to run for a school board? Because, by the way, I had no idea how political that was until I did an interview during the pandemic with a doctor who unrelated was running for a school board, but I didn't mention it because I didn't think it was relevant. And holy smokes, I had no idea. I just didn't have any idea of sort of the local politics around the school board. So I have a little bit of an appreciation for that. What was the catalyst behind thinking, you know what? I think I'm just going to throw my hat into the ring there.
I had helped to start a charter school as a volunteer. It was a group of parents, and we started a classical charter school here, just doing a good thing, and as I was helping to promote that charter school, I was talking to a lot of parents who had concerns about our A school district. And I thought, wow, I thought I was kind of alone or in the minority in my concerns, which is why I was helping to start this school. But it turns out they were pretty widespread. So that led me to start a parents group. And we started going to school board meetings and advocating at the school board. This is back in 2013, 2012. So before it was cool to go to these things. And I'm looking at these people like they are making decisions on behalf of me and my children. Like they have no idea what it's like to have kids in school. They were all retirement age, many of them former union members, former teachers. God bless them. But I felt like we needed a parent to be on that board. And out of our little parent group, I kind of just drew the short straw as someone who could run and perhaps win. And so I did. But I had someone tell me the same thing. These races are so dirty. I can't believe you're running for school board. And I was like, what? School board? Oh man, they were not kidding.
It was really eye-opening for me. What was your education background? Did you grow up in the public school system? You mentioned having education being really part of your growth. Just tell us a little bit about your past there.
Yeah, my parents got divorced when I was 11, and my mom being a single mom, working multiple jobs, I was in public schools, and she really didn't have time to pay attention to my education. And I just decided after almost really failing out of high school that I needed to go to college and change my life trajectory so that I did not have to live in poverty. And so I really talked my way into Florida State University. There's a whole story around that. And once I got to college, I buckled down and I graduated with honors, got a master's degree. And because of that, of course, that gave me opportunities for a great career and a great family and really changing completely where my trajectory would have been based on my original circumstances.
Well, can you tell us a little bit of that story of talking your way into college? Because it sounds too good to pass up.
Yeah, well, I had applied to Florida State. I was always a Florida State fan, and that's the only place I really wanted to go. And I hadn't heard anything. So I assumed I didn't get in. This is April of my senior year. And my mom was going to Tallahassee, and I was like, I'm going to come with you and go into the admissions office and see if I can't talk to someone. So I brought my senior year transcripts, which showed that I had completely turned things around. I literally went from getting D's and F's to getting A's and B's in my high school years, junior year, got good test scores. And I went in with a folder of my case, made my case to the admissions officer. He's like, give me a minute. He gets up, goes out of the room, comes back in and hands me a letter. And I still have the letter to this day. It's from late April of my senior year that accepted me to Florida State University. I have chills just saying it because it definitely, changed my whole life.
I love that story. What a great thing to do. And by the way, a lesson that you also learn as a journalist, that showing up in person, having that conversation face to face changes everything. It's a little intimidating to do. Girl got grit with that, right? Some gumption to go into the admissions office and do that. So good for you. That's amazing. What a great story. That gives us some background too, to just kind of talk about these broader issues about education, because we realize so much of the conversation is built upon personal experience, sometimes political perspective, but our education system really differs depending on where we live. And if we went to public school, or we went to a charter school, or we went to a private school. So let me just start with like a very broad question. There seems to be bipartisan agreement that we can do better when it comes to education. How to do it is where there's a lot of disagreement. So what do you think is the key? What is the priority to making education in America better?
For me, it comes down to a free market system. Every system that we've had in the history of our country that has operated in a monopoly is low quality, is not responsive to the needs of the public, and does not evolve with the needs of our country and our society. And we've seen that in education. So part of my mission in expanding school choice is not just for the sake of choice, but really for the sake of bringing free market competition and principles into the education space. When parents are consumers and they have the ability to make individual decisions on behalf of their children, they care about their children the most, of course. It's not just going to help their individual child, but it's going to bring about a marketplace of education innovations where different schools are competing, but different programs are also competing, different curricula are competing to see who is going to be the best. It's also going to bring about information flow that we haven't seen in education before. And the government doesn't need to tell us what restaurants to go to, right? We look at Yelp, they give us pictures, reviews, and basically everything we need to know to make a decision. The free market did that. And when parents are consumers and all of their attention is towards how are they going to choose the right school for their child, we're going to have innovations in that space as well to bring more transparency and more accountability to all of our school programs.
So how does the existence of the Department of Education work against what you're describing?
Well, these one-size-fits-all mandates from the federal government, all the way from Washington, certainly stifle innovation and the ability for parents to make decisions on behalf of their kids. I've been advocating for dismantling the Department of Education since the Common Core days, which is back in 2009, 2010, when I first got involved. I had no idea that decisions were being made in Washington that affected my child's classroom, and I thought it was absurd. How am I going to advocate there?
Can I pause you there? I don't mean to jump in, but I think this is such an important point, because one of the things that we've heard time and time again, and we've reported covering this story, is that, wait a minute, the federal government has very little overreach into your local education system, because most of the funding, most of the decisions are being made on a local level. So when you're talking about this federal overreach or these strings attached, what specifically are you talking about?
Well, that is a great point, because you're right. It's only 10% of the funding. But for a while there, when you're talking about No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top, there were strings attached to that 10% that affected the other 90%, requiring states to have certain standards, to take certain tests, to have certain levels of reporting that created a one-size-fits-all system, maybe without intending to, or maybe with intending to. But nevertheless, the way that districts and states complied with those mandates in order to get the funding did homogenize the system all the way down and discourage pilot projects and other things, because it didn't fit into the mold that was required in order to receive those funds.
Can you give us an example of that in practical terms?
Yeah, testing is one of them, requiring that you test every grade and certain subjects at every grade level. At the time, there weren't, and even still aren't, tests that meet different types of pedagogy, like classical education. The CLT just came out a few years ago, classical learning tests, that speaks more to that population. Well, you couldn't have a public school teaching classically, even so far as 4 years ago when I was starting classical charter schools. It was very difficult because you still had to prepare kids for a national test or the like that did not follow a classical model of education. So that's just one example where that top-down mandate, which forced Florida and all the other states to test every single year to have a state-specific test that was normed a certain way, would harm our ability to teach fully classical because it required us to teach certain things at certain times because we were going to be accountable to the specific test and not a test that aligned with our curriculum.
So in a practical sense, again, as a parent, if I had a child that was in 4th grade in public school, let's just say in Texas, and they were taking a test, we could connect the dots here that the test was part of a requirement to get federal funding. And so that's why the schools were doing these tests. So it wasn't something that necessarily my state or my local school district wanted. It was part of a broader check the box of we're going to do testing, we're going to collect data. And this is in part sort of my responsibility as a public school in order to, or a public school district to receive this federal funding.
Yes. And as you said, that's only 10% of the overall funding. Now let's bring it to today for a second here when it comes to Title I funding and IDEA funding, where what Linda McMahon and President Trump have said is they want those funds to continue, but without the strings attached. So if I'm receiving funds in order to provide services to either low-income students or students with disabilities, instead of having to report back on how I am providing those services and fill out specific forms, as we've heard from teachers that sometimes takes longer than providing the services themselves, the expectation from the federal government now is that we're going to provide the funding, but you, local school district, and you, state, you're the ones who have to determine how that funding is used and how it's going to be reported so that you can be held accountable to one another on making sure that those needs are being met.
Do you think there's a value to national data collection for schools? You know, I was looking back on the history of the Department of Education, goes back to even the foundation to Civil War times, and this idea of, oh, we're going to kind of keep track of like what states are doing and how they're doing it. Is there a value to the federal government doing that?
Yes, and that the NAEP, for example, the Nation's Report Card, which is what how we're making the case to dismantle the department is because we collect this information right on the NAEP, and that 1 in 3 children are not reading proficient right now. So that is important that we continue and we have that continuity of data so we can see how our students are doing across the country. It's been discussed that that would move over to the department that handles the census so that we do continue tracking that data. Where are the students, what type of households are they coming from, and how does that affect their performance, I think is really important. And so, yes, that there is a role in the federal government for that data collection, but that just needs to be part of the accountability through transparency that the government is providing. And then we, as voters in our respective states, have to hold our elected officials accountable for the performance of our students in our state. And they can no longer blame the federal government for the strings that they supposedly have attached to these funds.
It's interesting to think about it, to understand, well, maybe a state like Texas would embrace more of a classical education, where a state like California, where I'm from, would do something different. But that's part of your decision as a citizen about what state you live in and what school district you attend. And it really does bring accountability more to a local level when you kind of, again, connect the dots here. I was listening to a bunch of interviews by former secretaries of the Department of Education, a few of them from the Obama administration, just to get a better understanding of what's the point of view of wanting to hold on to the Department of Education, either as it is or just keep it functioning even in a limited way. And so one of the former secretaries, John King, was expressing some of his concerns about the risk of the Department of Education going away and saying, listen, there is the possibility that we could lose funding for certain schools for programs like extracurricular activities or special needs. But he brought up this other point about how under the Department of Education, there is a way of an empowerment by the federal government to monitor civil rights and to make sure that discrimination is not happening in schools and to make sure that there is equity. So if someone has, for example, a disability, a learning disability, they're getting access just like another student. And obviously there's all sorts of different forms of discrimination that we could talk about here. But what about that role within the Department of Education? What do you think is the risk of that going away? Do you share some of the same concerns as he's voiced?
Well, I would, but there's a plan for that. So let's start with the Office of Civil Rights. There is also an Office of Civil Rights in the Justice Department. And so it's natural that that Office of Civil Rights will be moved over to Justice so that all civil rights violations, whether they happen in a school or outside of a school at a business, are going to the same place in Justice. I actually just heard from a parent who reported a civil rights violation in her child's school to Justice, and then it had to be referred from Justice to the Department of Education. So it's already happening, and those individuals who are handling education-related civil rights violations can be moved over to Justice, and that can continue. When it comes to students with disabilities, IDEA existed before the Department of Education existed, and those were enforced through HHS. And so it's also envisioned that HHS will take whatever's left that is related to human services, education, if it does remain as a service that we think the federal government needs to handle, that it may be in a department like HHS going forward.
I'm curious with your business background on this, the price of bureaucracy, because when you talk about things getting referred, even for example, that one case that you mentioned, there's a paper trail, you got a lot of people involved, you got a lot of people working on the case, and maybe rightfully so. But when you were looking at the Department of Education and the price of bureaucracy, what is that price to an average American family? Is there a way of understanding what having this overarching federal department costs American families when it comes to education?
Now, oftentimes we look at the department, which has about 4,400 employees to start with. And then, of course, that was reduced by half a couple of weeks ago. And we think that's the cost of bureaucracy, right? The 4,400 or the now 1,300 employees. But there is a shadow government that exists at the state and local level to support those 4,400 employees at the federal level. So the person at the federal level that's passing out that money and the other person at the federal level that's receiving the reporting back from the states, who's doing that at the state level? You have another layer of bureaucrats that exist solely to receive and report back to the federal government. That's at the state level. Then you have them at the district. And as a school board member, I can tell you there were plenty of employees that existed solely for the purpose of federal reporting and compliance. And not just at the district level. You also have people at every single school that are also complying and tracking and checking boxes and filing paperwork. And so what President Trump envisioned as a business person like myself is that all of those people are not necessary. Let's just get the money in the hands of the schools and as close to the teachers as possible so that the maximum amount of those funds can be used on the actual services to the student. It's been estimated that's about 40 cents on the dollar that's being spent between the federal government distribution and actually meeting the students' needs.
That's fascinating. And it brings up a differing of philosophy. And I've noticed this covering the Trump administration, because when I describe some of the actions that are being taken and I'm reporting on it and explaining the philosophy here is not from a political background, it's from a entrepreneurial, real estate, business background. That's a different approach to government than, for example, someone that has worked in government for their entire career. So it's just a different way of approaching things. But some from our community have pushed back on that characterization, said, yeah, Jenna, that might be true. But the reality is that government is not supposed to function like the private sector. It's supposed to function differently. And this is really at the core of things, isn't it, Erika? Like whether or not the government should function like an efficient business or should function as an efficient public service, and whether those things are just opposed to each other. It's a very interesting, when you get to the core of it, it's a very interesting philosophical debate.
It is, and it's a debate that I've been having since I ran for school board. Because, of course, I was looking at $1 billion budget in my local school district and how inefficient it was. Looked at the organizational chart with all of these titles that nobody knows what they do, and it's a bunch of feel-good nonsense that wasn't actually helping meet students' needs and actually make parents who I felt were our consumers and taxpayers be satisfied with our service levels. And for me to say that it should be operating like a business and parents should be treated like consumers and we should be reporting to the taxpayers on the efficiency and effectiveness of our ROI, oh man, you would have thought I was killing puppies from the dais speaking like we should be running efficiently like a business. But what has made America great? Big government or efficient and effective businesses and the innovation that it provides to our country? So I would argue that business is doing a lot better than government has done in delivering high quality services to the American people. And there's definitely something to be learned from that, both in the government sector as well as the nonprofit sector, if we want to go that far.
It's a very interesting point of view to consider. And I think this is obviously a fundamental debate that we've had in the past, and we're going to continue to have way into the future. But you've really given us a lot to think about. I just have a final question for you, because I saw your announcement about, it being encouraging of President Trump moving to dissolve the Department of Education. And one of the things that you said is that, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, what could become of the education system in America is a system that would empower parents and truly serve the best interests of children and family. What does that look like to you? If you could paint us a picture of the goal, what does it look like?
For me, it's every parent being able to make choices among multiple high quality options. I mean, there are so many parents in this country who have one option and one option only, and that option is not very good. Schools that have 0% of their students who are reading or doing mathematics on grade level. That's tragic, should never be the case. But even my friends and neighbors, when I got into this, they only had one option. And it might have been an A school or a B school, but it wasn't an A school for their child. And that's so important. Every child is different. We have to be able to make decisions for our individual children. And there's absolutely no reason in a place like America, where we have such innovation and the most brilliant minds in the world, that we wouldn't have multiple customizable options at our fingertips when it comes to our children's education. And that the outcomes, it would be one thing if the monopoly was putting out great outcomes, and who can complain about that? No, the outcomes are terrible and they're getting worse. So I envision that every parent is going to have multiple options, high quality options that they're going to be able to choose from. They're going to have all the information they need to make a decision, and they're going to have the funding and the agency to make decisions on behalf of their children. And in that case, the competition and the free market principles will be at work, and everyone will get a better education as a result.
It sounds amazing. Is it going to cost us more as taxpayers at the local level?
Not if history is any indication, because charter schools and private schools are performing better and parents are more satisfied with the outcomes at a lower cost everywhere that school choice is implemented. So if that's the case now, imagine when we do it at scale.
It's fascinating. That's what I'm trying to approach this story through Smarter News, with an expansion. Instead of looking at, we want to get a lot of different opinions on this, because is this a real moment where we could create something amazing, and maybe include voices from all sides on it, because there's been a lot to learn. So could this be a point, not just of disruption, but creative disruption? So the end product is something that everyone feels better about. So you give us a lot to think about, Erika. Wow. It's been really great to listen to you talk a little bit about your experience, share your story, and wow, there's a lot of different points of view to consider. So what are you watching for next, by the way, just as I let you go? Because there's this question about how fast this could happen with the Department of Education. And we don't really know. We know that this is a move to dissolve it, but who knows how long that could take, and if Congress could get involved. So what are you watching for next?
Well, the Department of Education is on the clock to respond to the school choice executive order that the president put out a few weeks ago prior to this dismantling the department. And that is supposed to allow for some guidance, some creative ways that states can provide funding directly to parents to make decisions, either through districts or some other creative means. So that's what we're looking out for, that guidance in response to the school choice executive order coming up here soon.
Oh, that's good to know. I missed that. There's a lot to keep in our mind. Erika, is that the understatement of the century? The last couple of weeks, I'm like, there's a lot to juggle here. and this is one of the big stories that really affect American families. So thank you so much for your expertise and perspective. We really look forward to having you back. Thank you.
Thank you.